another edition of The Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thanks for joining us again this week. This week, as I sit down with Mr. David Granger, leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, we're dealing with a very saddening situation, a situation that seems to not be going anywhere. And in recent newspapers, you would have seen that women were either murdered or beaten along with children. So today, Mr. Granger will focus on domestic violence and violence against women and children in our society. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika.
Great to have you as always. Mr. Granger, I'm going to ask the first question, which to many of us now, it's becoming very difficult to answer, if not impossible. Can we stop domestic violence and violence against women and children in our society, or is it at a stage where there is no turning back?
Yes, we can stop domestic violence, and it is a very serious problem affecting several strata of society, and of course both the hinterland and the coastland. Sometimes you find surprisingly well-off people are involved, not just a matter of poor people. And it is something that could be stopped, and the government has a key role to play in arresting what I would say is an epidemic of domestic violence.
What should be, and I'm asking this, of course, you are a male, what should be the role of the male? And I'm not talking here about males who are actually abusive or who abuse their women and children or even murder women, but a normal man in society, such as yourself. What should be the role of the male to eradicate this scourge?
Well, I wouldn't want to compartmentalize the problem and trying to say, well, there's a male role and a female role. There's certainly role because this is a crime against humanity, and it might be true that most of the victims are women, but we have to look at it holistically, and I would feel that we must look at it individually regardless of whether they're men or women. Then we could look at it at the level of the organizations, and then we could look at it as a national problem. But certainly at the individual level, it seems to me from the evidence that has been presented by the numerous cases in the newspaper, it seems to me that there is certainly a level of miseducation among young people. Maybe it could be that men, especially young boys at schools, are improperly taught, or they expect or they disrespect women. And this may be a problem that they have not learned at home or in the schools or in the churches or whichever religious organizations they belong to. So I think the start of the problem, you're quite right, is at the individual level, and it might be based on a question of respect, that from the earliest childhood, young people, young males must be made to respect females, and females must be able to respect themselves. And I think that is where it starts, at the individual level. After that, we can go to maybe the institutional level, what should take place at the home, school, or church. And after that, we could look at the national level. But certainly, the solution to the problem starts with the individual. What goes into his or her head, how he or she is brought up, will determine to a great extent how humans behave in later life. So I think that is the start of the problem. You're quite right.
I'm going to eventually come back to the national level in a bit, but I want to ask you this question. Do you believe that our young people, or I should say our citizens, they're getting into serious relationships at too much of a tender age? Do you believe that that somehow also contributes to the problem?
I don't think that the seriousness of relation is an issue. Young people throughout history, are always attracted to each other. But society would have norms, it would have rules, it would have conventions which prevent immature persons from entering, into certain types of relationships. For example, I would say that adolescents had better spend their time in school rather than setting up house, trying to be like married people. And if people were properly at school or properly at work, I don't think that is a question. So I'm not worried about the seriousness of the relationship. Maybe it's a good thing for people to have relation. I don't know what you mean by serious, if it's a coded word or coded expression. But what needs to be emphasized is that there must be respect, there must be maturity, there must be some approach on the part of the participants based on respect. And it shouldn't be one based on victimization, it should be one based on cruelty and abuse. That is what I'm more concerned about rather than seriousness, whatever you meant by seriousness.
Okay. National level, government. How much more can government do? And the first question really should be, has government done enough to try to help our women and children?
Well, I wouldn't say government as government. Certainly there is legislation, there's the DVA, the Domestic Violence Act, and there's a ministry called the Ministry of Human Services and Social Security, which has overarching responsibility. But within the government is something called the Guyana Police Force. And I think we should deal with that first. The type of violence we've seen reported in the newspaper and on the media is not something that is sudden or spontaneous. When, as in today's paper, we see a young man, a teenager really, killing his girlfriend who's another teenager, I would like to think that there were indicators somewhere along the line, and those indicators were ignored, and people didn't pay attention to them. So what can the government do? This is taking place behind closed doors, this is taking place in somebody's bedroom. The government can intrude, but if we are going to speak about policing, I would say that one of the roles of neighborhood policing, one of the roles of citizen security should be to detect any breakdown in relationships in small communities. And if you're going to talk about community policing, they should be able to pick up the traces or the indicators of violence. For example, there was a case of a murder on the East Bank probably some time ago, but for several months, neighbors had heard shouting and screaming, and next morning the wife would turn up looking bruised and battered, but nothing was done. I would feel one of the roles of community policing, one of the roles of neighborhood policing would be to find out whether these relations are in fact abusive, what was the screaming about, how come this woman is battered, and take preventive action by arresting the husband or cautioning the husband. Secondly, within the police force, and the police force is critical, let's not run away from that, because the police force is the main law enforcement agency in the country. So the police force is critical. You need to have more women police officers, persons who are trained in counseling, persons who are more sympathetic towards the likely victims. And you need to have an environment within which these reports could be made. Too often we hear of situations in which victims complained that they had called the police or they had made earlier reports and the police ignored the reports. So it seems to me that there is a failure on the part of the police, either to take preventive action, that is to identify households where abuse has been reported, or when reports are made, to take action. It could be because many of the police officers are male. That's why I insist that there must be more female police officers who must visit the premises, must visit the households, and determine whether there is a problem. Sometimes the women say, okay, I'm glad you come, constable, but you beg pardon, and it wouldn't happen again. Of course, if people are abusive, if people are of a violent temperament, and it does happen again, well then I believe there needs to be much more serious intervention. But at the level of the police force, you certainly need more training for police officers, you need more female police officers, you need a comfortable environment where women feel they can make up, because sometimes the husband could be a big shot, and when a report is made, the police will simply dismiss it. So we need to look at the quality of policing, because it is now a crime, and I would reckon that, I don't have the percentages, but certainly a significant proportion of murders are domestic, are related to domestic violence.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the female police officers, but you said something that kind of jumped out at me, the example that you gave whereby someone may report a violent act, a female may report a violent act being committed against her by her husband, and then the police show up and then she said, okay, he begged pardon. So now I'm really going to ask you this, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but in a situation like that, and there are several situations like that across Guyana, folks on the outside looking in may say, look, in her case, she said he begged pardon and whatever. If a woman does not make the choice or does not choose to come out of the relationship, no one can help her. Your thoughts on that particular statement?
Well, sometimes, again, this is a speculative response. Sometimes people do not come out of the relationship because of maybe economic privation, that they have nowhere to go. And sometimes, the wife may have come from a different part of the country, may have come from the hinterland, and she simply has no place to go back to. So she stays in an abusive relationship. Now, what does the state do? The state cannot actually provide a home for everyone, and that is why you need to, as I say, walk on two legs. You need to have a mechanism for reconciliation, bringing the two sides together. Or where that is not possible, I think there is now an official office, a part of the legal system, which provides for mediation. And in some cases, the court could make a ruling obliging the offending partner, if it is a male, to pay some sort of maintenance to the person who's abused, and if in that case it's his wife and she has children, to pay a certain amount of money every month, so that she can leave the home and set herself up independently. But there needs to be a halfway house, so somewhere that she goes to immediately to prevent further abuse, and then there needs to be some legislative or law enforcement involvement or intrusion into the case. But I think if there were options, persons who are really physically battered and who might be apprehensive of their death. Some people know that their partners are so violent they're going to kill them. Some people know that. Some women do live in fear. But in those situations, we need to have the state provide a safe house. Maybe over a period of 30 days or 60 days, the person could live in safety while the legislative wheels start to turn.
All right. Coming back to female police officers, do we have the capacity to train them to deal with these matters?
Yes, I think over the last 40 years we've had a much greater consciousness of women's issues. Our party, the People's National Congress, introduced several measures for women's equality. I think as early as 1970 we might have introduced a white paper on gender equality in the National Assembly. We do have a large number of persons who have been trained, and it is something that is now accepted around the world, certainly in Western democracies, and the police force must train its officers in this regard. So yes, there is knowledge, there are persons capable of conducting such training, and it must be done because we see the cost of not doing it. And it is a fact, as I said earlier, that most police officers are male. And it could be that due to their own lack of training and due to their own bigotry and prejudice, they are very unsympathetic to victims of trafficking. So it is something that can be done. I do believe that there are enough trained people in Guyana. We don't have to go overseas. And we could help to solve the problem.
I want to focus a little now on the children some who were murdered, as in recently, two of them were murdered by their father after their father badly wounded the mother. I'm talking about children who were murdered and the ones who were left to suffer after the parent, or in cases murder, suicide, after the parents have passed on. How do we protect these children and help them to really become, if I should use the word, productive adults in society, to not let those things affect them?
Well, you could never tell what affects another person. Children mostly live in the same homes with their parents. They hear the shouting and screaming. They probably see the violence, and there's an impact. And even if they don't speak about it, they would remember, a husband beating a wife or the wife beating the husband. And the images stay in their minds for a long time. Most children learn lessons about social relations within the first decade of their lives. And if they grow up, even in that period, disrespecting the other gender, if they grow up feeling that the only way to get what they want is by violent means, then it is difficult for them to get rid of that behavior when they're in the 30s or 40s. So it is important that we get children at that early stage. But it is something that has to be achieved by joint action, by parents themselves, by the churches, and by the schools. It's not something that could be done without frequent intervention by these agencies. And people have to work on it. For example, when I was much younger, it was typical to see in a movie, people smoking. But now it is hardly likely you see people actually smoking. I mean, in movies. I mean, here and there you see it, but in my youth, it was regular. I mean, it was fashionable. Women and men were smoking, But because of action, legislative action, and of course because of the consciousness of civil society, people were able gradually to remove cigarettes from the screen. Similarly, people had very violent films. I think even now some of the films are still much too violent. And occasionally in movies you'd see children being whipped or flogged, or women being beaten and sometimes raped. And this made, I would say, this normalized the crime. It gave the viewer the impression, hey, it's okay to beat children or beat women, or it's okay to rape. And that could have an impact on adults because they grow up seeing these movies. Killings, sometimes you had movies of the American Wild West or gangster movies where there were mega killings. Even now there's too much killing. And people feel that killing is, that's okay, I'm just doing like I saw in the movies. So we need to have the strength of character. If we can remove cigarettes from the screens, we could remove violence from the screens. And we could insist that certain types of violence, particularly violence directed against vulnerable members of society, particularly women and children, should be removed, or we just don't allow the films to be shown. So I think there needs to be a turnaround on the part of churches, on the part of schools, on the part of civil society, and on the part of government to remove those images so that the child doesn't grow up feeling it's okay. But in the final analysis, it comes back to what happens in the home, that people just have to be educated. And we have, I think, at the level of the schools, because some children already grow up feeling that it's okay to beat your partner. But schools must teach respect. Schools must teach children to respect the other gender, and we must bring this out in our culture, in our relationships. And it is a total picture. When you see children being put on the stage to dance, they must be properly dressed, and the actions that they display must be must not be actions which are calculated to inflame the passions. There must be, we must change our culture in the schools, in the churches, and in the homes. It's a cultural problem. Look, let me make another comparison.
Sure.
In the 19th century and for much of the 20th century, flogging was okay at schools. If a child came late, he expected to be flogged. If a child did bad work, the child was flogged. If the child misbehaved, stayed away from school and picking mangoes or something like that from the neighbor's yard and then came to school late, the child expected to be flogged. If you got some F's in your grades. But we've moved away from that now. I remember at school you used to say, hey, 6 of the best, But now it's because the whipping was normally in batches of 6. Children got 6 at the time. It's called 6 of the best. But no, it's not acceptable. In some types of punishment, like people could be hanged, you could be beheaded, you could be electrocuted. In America, you could still be electrocuted. But those forms of punishment are regarded as barbaric. And there's no place for that in civilized society now. Many countries have abolished the death penalty. So as civilization advances, as societies move forward, we should distance ourselves from violence and build societies on a more consensual basis, on respect, on nonviolence, on a different way of settlement of disputes. In fact, in a partnership of national unity, we have, as one of our principles, that even political disputes must be solved in a consensual manner. It is one of the principles of APNU, that we shouldn't resort to violence. So we have accepted it, and many societies in the Western Hemisphere have accepted it. And we just need to reinforce our education of young people that violence is not the solution to our problem. And we need to make sure that our films, the books, illustrations, whatever comes through the social media, take the same message. Violence is not a humane way of resolving differences between people.
You did mention the institutions, meaning the schools, the churches, and so forth.
Home.
And yes, sir, the home. Do you believe that instead of these institutions or organizations working separately to do their own thing, if there can be someone to organize some kind of major collaboration or consultations with all of the institutions, do you think that would be a little more effective than everybody going their own way and doing what they think is best to eradicate or stem domestic violence?
Eventually, all the roads lead back to central government, but in all fairness, the government cannot go into every bedroom, into every school, and you need a broad-based approach. That is why I feel that civil society has an important role to play in the churches. I kept emphasizing the churches, for those people who do go to church, that violence is not the way to resolve disputes. And collectively, civil society must bring pressure to bear on the lawmakers, that is the National Assembly, and the government, to do away with violent punishment. A simple thing like the encouragement of beating in schools, the encouragement of capital punishment, could give people the mistaken impression that, hey, it's okay to kill. As long as the state does the killing, it's not okay to kill anymore. Maybe it was okay 100 years ago, but it's not okay to kill anymore. And similarly, it's not okay to whip and flog. There was a time in our prisons when people could actually be sentenced to be whipped, to be flogged. What they call a cat of nine tails. And people would be strung up in the prison and whipped. It doesn't happen anymore. It's inhumane. So we need to send a new cultural message to our children that the word is respect. Boys must respect women, women must respect boys, women must respect themselves. Because what we see happening is that younger and younger people are resorting to violence. And let me tell you something, off script if you want to call it that. A few years ago when I was in the Defense Force, I paid a visit to the prison. And when you see how persons who are charged with murder are kept sometimes 5, 6, or 7 years without being sentenced. They simply become like vegetables. They just eat and sleep. They cannot be brought out to do work like other prisoners. They just kept there for a murder, for just 1 minute of passion. And their whole lives are wasted away. Sometimes they get sentenced to death, sometimes they get sentenced to life imprisonment. But for that 1 minute or moment of anger, they don't not only the life of the person the victim is lost, but their own lives are lost because they become, they just go to the prison to vegetate. So if people could see what happens, I think, what happens after they commit a crime of murder or violence, I think perhaps they might think twice about committing that crime.
All right, sir. In the final moments of this program, and this is the side where I know persons will get very, very emotional because we are all human. What would David Granger say to persons, especially recently? We had the 18-year-old killing his 17-year-old girlfriend, the man who killed his wife and then he committed suicide, and then the other man who killed his 2 children and badly wounded his wife. What would David Granger say to the grieving relatives of these persons who have no choice but to carry on?
Well, certainly they have my sympathy. I would extend condolences to the families of persons who have lost relatives, children. I would extend my sympathy to all persons, friends who have been affected, because sometimes these victims have very loving friendships with other persons. But most of all, I would say, let us take a message there to younger persons that violence is not the answer. And, what has happened in the past has happened. We're sorry about that, but from today, let us look forward to the future and build friendships based on respect. If you see your child, your daughter, or your son getting involved in an abusive relationship, counsel them, and if they don't respond to counseling, separate them and do your best to separate them, because it's like rot. It doesn't get better. If you have a pothole in the road, if you ignore it, it wouldn't get smaller. And similarly, if you have a rotten orange, if you ignore the rot, it wouldn't get better. It will continue to decay. And parents have a role, because parents must supervise their children, particularly girl children, when they reach the age of puberty, when they start going, well, many of them go to co-educational schools, they have friends. Parents must give them advice about, not only safe sex, but also safe relations. So let us look to the future. Let us build our relationships based on respect, and let us eliminate violence against women and children, but let's eliminate all violence in our communities.
Thank you very much, sir. Well said. This has been another program of the public interest, and we were discussing, of course, myself and the leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, the Honorable David Granger. We were discussing domestic violence and violence against women and children in our society. And just to echo the sentiments of the opposition leader, I'd like you all to start getting more involved, especially if there are signs of violence in the relationships of your relatives or friends. Until next time, I'm Malika Ramsey. Thanks for watching.